Hello and welcome to another episode of Rustacean Station. I'm your host, Alan Wyma. Today I'm with Eric Smith, who is known online as Peyton Rules, so don't confuse it with like I did before. That's not his name. He's just a big fan of Walter Payton, so because he's from the Chicago area, same with me. In any case, he is the author of Game Development with Rust and WebAssembly, which once I saw the title, I got immediately interested. So I think WebAssembly is definitely something that's a huge emerging topic. And I think also with Rust, game development will be definitely much more interesting. So both of these things really sparked an interest in me, which caused me to reach out to his publisher when I could just reach out to him directly. I just got confused by the name, as we were talking about before. In any case, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself very quickly, and then we can get cracking on other questions. Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So you gave a pretty good introduction, but yeah, I'm Eric Smith. And so if you find Peyton Rules online, that's probably me. Like that's my Twitter, that's my GitHub, that's my Twitch. And I started to get used to when I was doing more Twitch streaming last year, I started to get used to like, if you rate a channel, they say, thanks, Peyton. And I'm like, I'm not going to correct them. I guess I'll just answer that now. And yeah, so I've been hard at work on the book for Rust game development WebAssembly, which title might need a little work. Still can't seem to get it to roll off the tongue. I'm a software developer, have been for like enough years on working in almost anything. I'll joke sometimes that if it's got an if statement in it, I've probably written some code in it. But these days, my favorite language to work in anyway is Rust. I mean, I guess that's everything about me.
Yeah, definitely. It kind of sounds like me. I mean, I play with just a little bit of everything to a certain extent. But I mean, you must have your favorites, right? I suppose Rust is definitely one of your favorites since you're taking the time to write a book in it.
Yeah, it's definitely one of my favorites. I joke with some of my coworkers that I'll have severe programming language addiction. So if I'm in the middle of a project and someone's like, we're going to do a book reading club on Haskell. Do you want to join? I'm like, you go away. Yes, I desperately want to do that, but I do not have time right now. So yeah, like some of my favorites are like, I like Rust a lot. I like F# a lot for a lot of the same reasons, even though they're sort of they're in different places. But I mean, I feel like all languages have like their pluses and minuses. I've done some Elixir and I've heard the podcast before, so I know you do it. And there's a lot of cool stuff in there. Actually,
let me ask you a question. Did you play with Elixir because of the podcast, or was this just unrelated?
No, a lot of I work at a software consultancy called 8th Light, and I should say that slowly and clearly, only because no one can ever hear it right. It's 8th, the number 8 Light. And a lot of my colleagues have been really into Elixir for a long time. And so now I happen to be on a project where I'm actually doing front end. So by day, I'm doing front end development or not Android. So Android development in Kotlin, and our back end is in Elixir. So because I'm stubborn, every once in a while where it's like, they'll say, well, we can ask the back end people to do that feature in Elixir. It's like, I don't want to wait. Hold on. Let's see if we can get this done right now.
So you're implementing features in Elixir, then you're saying?
A little bit.
Okay. Let's see, how's the experience been so far?
So without saying too much, because I can't, usually say client names and things like that. But so I like the Elixir language quite a bit. And I mean, like I did Ruby for years. First project at 8th Light was a Ruby on Rails project. It's part of the reason I joined. I wanted to do Ruby. So you can see the familiarity there. Actually, it's kind of true in like Rust. You can see the Ruby influence in both of those languages. It's like in Elixir, you can tell someone was like, I like Erlang, but I kind of like, and in Rust, of course, you've got things like Cargo, where they just hired the guy who wrote Bundler and said, hey, make Bundler for Rust, would you? And a lot of the people that have been involved, like Steve Klapnick in the Rust community, have come from the Ruby community. And I think you could see the way that they learn from some of the issues, a lot of the issues from Ruby, and really other languages, but in Rust. Some of the stuff I really like about Rust is just like how easy it is to get something set up, how a lot of problems are taken care of for you, like dependency management, stuff like that.
Yeah, I never really thought a part about Ruby kind of influencing Rust, but I did know from Ben on this podcast that Cargo was written by the people who wrote Bundler, which is extremely interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think Bundler started up a lot of things, in my opinion. Like, I'm so Ruby at the time when Bundler came out. I was really into it. So I don't know about others, but I feel like that one really started the ideas. Okay, we have to have something similar to this. Like Go finally has something after years of not having anything.
Finally, yeah.
Yeah, NPM had one. Like to me, like if you release a language without something like Bundler or Cargo, I don't see how you can succeed in a positive way. But I mean, Node and Go has managed to do that, right? I mean, there was no npm for a couple of years, if I remember correctly.
Well, and you can sort of see how, like, since Rust came with it, like batteries included that way, you can also see like how they learned from like the bumpy progress of Bundler. I was working in Ruby long enough ago that, we did something like checked in all our compile gems into source to make sure we had everything. And I remember working with another person who was joining us for a little bit, and I was sort of making excuses for the way things were set up because to make it work. And he's like, no, it's okay. I can see what happened. This was before Bundler, and so you made up your own, just like everybody did, and so everyone's looks a little different. But Bundler had its, fair share of problems, just like npm does, until they sort of worked out all the kinks. And Cargo just feels like, well, here it is, all the kinks pre-worked out for you. I'm sure if I deal with it enough, there'll be something that makes me mad. But that's one tool in particular that like seems to always work well.
Yeah, how do you feel about Mix and Elixir then compared to Cargo? I mean, they're similar but kind of different, right?
Yeah, they have a lot of the same stuff. I have more Rust experience than I do Elixir, to be honest. So, but I'd say it's generally a positive experience too. But I think it's got that same sort of influence. And it's all when the rest of the day is using Gradle, which is not nearly as nice to use as Bundler or Mix, Cargo. More full featured, I suppose, because you got a whole groovy programming language there. Actually, it's probably a lot more full featured if I were to think about it and list items that Gradle can do. But the just like out of the box experience isn't pleasant.
I feel like it's kind of weird. Like the whole community of Java is kind of settled on Gradle, but at the same time, like a lot of people stay away from Groovy, which is kind of interesting. I don't know. This is like just I've only been in and out on the edges of Java of the JVM, right? I just feel like okay, everybody's either Kotlin or a lot of people are flocking to Clojure, and then when it comes to like basically nothing can beat Gradle for some weird reason. And so it's like you're only using Groovy just for Gradle. Like I don't see too many people using Groovy these days.
Yeah, I don't think I've seen it either. Like one time I know there was like Groovy on Grails that existed and was a thing. I don't know if it still exists or not. You could definitely use Gradle for other stuff. It's funny you mentioned Clojure because I've done Clojure before too, but it's been a while and I don't remember their line again. It's their dependency management tool, I think. But that's not built in with the language, and I think they were writing their own. I'm going to get the details wrong. I don't know if you get letters, but if there's any angry Clojure developers listening right now, I'm sorry. I'm just half remembering and not getting my facts straight.
Wait, Clojure, right? There's a lot of people doing Clojure, right? And I think a lot of people come to Clojure also from Datomic, right? So there's a company called Nubank in Brazil.
Sure.
Yeah, they're doing Clojure huge, right? They actually acquired Plataforma Tech, which was the company that helped to create Elixir. And all those guys are doing Clojure, which is quite interesting. So it's basically an acquihire. And they kind of really got into Clojure because of Datomic. And Datomic, I think you know what Datomic is, right?
So, yeah, I do. I'm familiar with it.
Yeah.
I haven't used it, but I know what it is.
Yeah, so for people maybe who don't know what is Datomic, Datomic's kind of like, in my opinion, it's like an appendable database. It's an immutable
only,
database.
Right?
Yeah. Written by the guy who wrote Clojure. So if you use Clojure, you find a lot of people end up using Datomic or the other way around. I think usually you go to Datomic and then you go to Clojure or something weird like that. But so it's Rich Hickey.
Yeah, that's another one where like one of my colleagues at 8th Light wrote a book on Clojure macros for Prog. So we got a bunch of Clojure people in the house at 8th Light too. Not as many as we used to. That's these days Elixir is kind of the popular one. I'm converting more and more people to Rust, I think, though.
Yeah. So for me, like just to give you my side, like I wouldn't build something unless I get some serious feedback from something without Elixir or Rust. And I tend to go for Elixir more because I think it's just a little bit faster feedback. No need to there's hot reload in there already, this kind of stuff. So I think that's kind of why I look at it. But I'm thinking maybe next time I build some service to go straight to Rust because I feel like more people will join in, right? I think Rust is more appealing for many reasons.
Like I think it's super appealing in the open source community. If you're trying to get a community thing, I think Rust is probably more. Maybe I'm wrong about no shade thrown to the Elixir community at all. Maybe I'm wrong about the popularity. Maybe I'm just looking in the wrong places. But like, there's a reason that Rust comes up as the most loved language on Stack Overflow all the time.
I think Rust comes up as both the most loved and most hated language at the same time, and that makes sense.
We don't talk about the other half.
Yeah, but I mean, like, it's really a love-hate relationship when you're learning it, and then after you do it for a while, you're like, all right, actually, I do love this, and I'm no longer fighting the borrow checker now. I'm like, maybe I'm fighting with the borrow checker for not catching something else or something like that. I don't know.
When I started to like the borrow checker, I was like, okay, does this mean I actually like it, or do I have Stockholm syndrome? I don't know, like Haskell programmers and monads that once you understand it, you justify to yourself that it's actually great. And as I say, like, kind of like the borrow checker now because of, even though like in a language that's garbage collected and you don't have to worry about memory, like I find myself thinking, when I worry about memory, I mean, sometimes yes, like if I just want to get something done, like I probably wouldn't use Rust to like script something that's a one-off. I tend to use just Python for that. But when I'm building a system, maybe I should worry a little bit more about memory. I don't necessarily have to get to the level of, I went back to school years ago and I had a couple C++ classes where everything talked about byte alignment, pack everything together to optimize it. I took a whole course in game up and probably don't need to get to that level on most projects. But even when, and I do this often, I do it once in the book where I just say, I'm going to go ahead and clone and move on because I can't quite work my way around how I want to do the borrow checker. I'm kind of glad it's there because I'm glad I'm seeing that I'm making that copy. Like I'm glad that I have to do a deep clone here, it won't work, which means if I was writing this code and, in another language I like, if I was writing it in F# tomorrow or C, or, I would not know I cloned it. It would just be there. I sometimes wonder, it's like, is that why we see so many programs that just balloon in memory?
So if you were to choose between F sharp and Rust, like which one would you go for? I guess maybe it probably depends on what you're trying to do, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think Rust is becoming a really good game dev language. Like, if I could just like wave a magic wand and be like, all game developers now do Rust, even the ones in the AAA studios. I think it's a really great language for that. I'm sure someone's got the argument out there as to why you should use C++ instead. And I mean, the argument for using C or C++ for AAA game dev is easy. There's already a ton of stuff in C and C++, right? Like you just pick up the Unreal Engine and you can go. And I've been thinking about this as the book gets closer and closer to finished. The reason we have all that stuff in C++ is because people built it. So I was a C and C++ programmer for the first 7-8 years of my career. And the reason we used it is because that's what you had and it's what you made almost anything in. Like I was working on just thick client Windows apps. And by the time I left, we were all like, we should be using C#. It's dumb that we're doing C++ for this. But like, it's what you had. So this is what games were made in. And my first job out of college was at a game company. And so I still have one game credit for Jet Fighter 4 that I worked on when I was 19. No, I wasn't 19. I was old enough to drink. I was 22. I was way older. And that whole thing was in C++, right? And now most of the stuff I worked on was like mission editor and doing levels and stuff. But so I didn't work on the core engine, which had chunks in assembly. But we didn't have, Unreal and Unity. So I'm sorry if I'm like 3 tangents deep, but like when I see like there's the website, arewegameyet.rs, I just want to be like, yes, you are. Make more game stuff. If you make more game stuff, if you build it, they will come. Like there's nothing you couldn't do that C++ does in the Rust community. You'd probably, to really get stuff, you probably have to write more unsafe code than like I like to write, but you could also write a lot more safe code than your traditional C++ program or C.
Yeah, this is true. Yeah, I mean, this is a good question, right? So I think a lot of people won't really look at it because it's like, okay, again, I'm an outsider when it comes to video game creation, but when I think about like game engines that are really popular, there's, yeah, like you said, Unreal, and then there's Unity, and then there's Godot, but Godot is kind of up and coming, and now it's kind of slowly up and coming. And I feel like if you're going to be doing Rust and any of these things, it seems like only Godot really supports it with the native bindings.
Yeah, Godot supports it.
Yeah.
I'm curious if you could do it in Unreal, but I'm not sure right now. I'm starting to need a new computer when the book is done, so I'm not sure I have the hardware to get the Unreal Engine going to try it out right now. But I assume in the Unreal Engine, you can load a library. I can build a library in Rust. I can make this work if I really want to. It probably will hurt. And I assume Unity is the same way. Because if I can build it in C++ or C, I can probably build it in Rust too. But it's probably going to be, 8 million bindings and a bunch of glue code and not work very well and not be worth the effort. But to your point, right? Like, yeah, Godot works pretty well with Rust. I've done some Rust stuff in Godot, and like I made a blackjack game. I actually made an iPhone app in Rust with Godot because I enjoy making problems for myself that are really, really hard. And I know Godot 4, when it comes out, is going to have a new way of doing bindings that I think is supposed to be easier to work with, but it works well with Rust. But what I was thinking of anyway was like, forgetting existing engines. And maybe this is because I don't play the modern games very much anymore. Like, I like all the retro games that I grew up with. And so it's like, maybe 6 or 7 with Civilization, whichever one they're on now. Maybe that used Unreal. But I bet Civilization 2 was just a bunch of C++ code and assembly code to make some stuff fast. It's like, what we just need is the Rust version of Unity to come in, or the Rust version of Unreal. There's got to be some company out there with time, money, and a game idea that's like, I'm going to build the real commercial quality engine, and it's going to be in Rust.
But what about like studios like Embark? I mean, they're really starting to build up, I think, the infrastructure and a lot of these kind of supporting libraries, right? So,
They
like,
are. They're getting there.
I'm kind of curious because, like I said before, like, again, I'm outside and I just feel like all those engines are not using Rust except for Godot. And I think that's what makes Godot kind of stand out to Rust people. Is like, okay, we have something that's kind of popular and we can use Rust out of the box. The other ones, maybe, like you said, could be
It's
quite
also free
painful.
as in beer, too. So
Yeah,
I'm a
which is
fan of
also
Godot.
super
So
attractive. Yeah, so it's like, okay, even better, right? I mean, Unity is also kind of free. I think Unreal also has something.
they both have a free-ish version. You start selling, but if you hit it big, you got to pay them back. What is it? Yeah, if you have so many people for Unity's got a license. Unreal, I don't remember the details on the Unreal one. I don't remember the details on either, but I used to kind of know the Unity one.
So I guess my question is more like, what should these like big studios do? Like, do they have to like go back and write everything from scratch? Actually, I'm not sure what these big studios do. I think you would know more than me. I mean, do they really just have their own in-house engine, or because I mean, it used to
Some
be
do.
when I understood from the past, right, is that you didn't have these kind of commercial engines that like every game you'd build a brand new engine from scratch, nearly, and
Right.
sometimes you'd reuse them. So is that kind of still the way some people are?
I think some places still are. I don't know it that well either because I got out of the industry a long time ago, at least, professionally. But there was a time that, like, and I mean, Unreal Engine is kind of the product of it, right? Like, they built it for the game Unreal. And now they iterate on it. They probably rewrite huge chunks of it periodically. But yeah, I mean, there was a time where, like, you just did a new engine for the next new game. I think it was always, I mean, I can't prove it, but I think it was always new in the same way. Like, if you've ever worked at a big company and they said, we're doing a big rewrite of thing X, and then you go look at thing X and find out that 2/3 of the first commit was copy pasted from the old code. Like, I think there was a lot of that going on. But I do think, like you mentioned, Embark, I don't know as much as I should about what they're doing. Like, I'm probably not much more familiar than you are. But like, the idea of getting to a commercial quality, using Vulkan or even some of the GPU libraries in Rust, like, if a company with pockets and ambition wanted to get there, I think you could. I think more likely you would probably get to there by independent people building piece after piece after piece until someone can put it all together into something bigger. Because, I mean, if I ran Electronic Arts tomorrow, would it make sense for me to invest a ton of money in an all new Rust based engine? Probably not. Not when you have 8 million lines of C lying around. But like a lot of this stuff, right? It's one day, it all starts with one hello world. One day there's a library, and then there's another person who's putting a bunch of chunks together. Someone writes a physics engine.
Yeah.
Then somebody has a game take off.
I ran into this issue where I kept having Python just kind of crap out and like nobody knows what's going on. And this is like a lot of stuff. And so I just said, okay, you know what? Just forget about this crap. Like, I don't care how long it takes. We're just rewriting all this stuff in something more manageable because I just cannot stand this. What the hell's going on? It's fine to develop it, but when you deploy it, like, it's just doing stuff and we don't know why it's acting in a certain way. It's driving me nuts. So like, I can imagine something like that where it's like, we got so many like random bugs and issues and memory leaks that it's just like, you know what, just we got to take some time and we got to like replace parts of this thing, at least the tricky bits that are just too shit.
So that I could imagine a big company definitely doing, right? Like, we're going to rewrite a subsection of our code that was in C. It's had security vulnerabilities. It's had memory errors. We're going to rewrite that part in Rust. I can totally imagine that.
I don't know,
But
there's a
I
lot of
can't.
things about DLCs, right? Oh, no, we'll fix this in a DLC. That's what I can hear
Yeah.
as a joke.
Well, I wasn't predicting they'd do it, but I can imagine that. I have trouble imagining, Epic Games tomorrow going, we're going to rewrite the Unreal Engine in Rust, and we'll put Fortnite on it. It'll be fine.
Yeah, I mean, so for you saying like, okay, we can do game engines, we can do games totally 100% in Rust, like, how would I say this? Like, let's start this way. If you were to talk to a developer who's been working with the top three, as I call it, right? Those three.
Yeah.
and they've been making games for a while, like, and then they're like, you know what, we want to go to like 100% Rust. What would you like tell them should be in their tool belt nowadays? Because you're saying game development is ready to go, right? So what would you say that they should be looking at?
Well, I'd say game development's as ready to go as the common game languages were ready to go 10 or 15 years ago, if that makes sense. So what I'm kind of saying is like if we held C sharp that, is in Unity to the same standard we're holding Rust now to say it's not ready to go, then they never build Unity because you can't use C sharp. It's not ready. Like someone has to build stuff to make it ready. I don't know what I think is missing per se, but that's partly because I'm not trying to write a AAA, 3D engine right now. My sort of interest, the games I kind of play, I mean, part of the reason I wrote a book on making an endless runner game that like you just get to play with in the background for a little while. It's simple, it's easy to pick up, and you only play it for a little while. It's because that's closer to what I play these days. Because I got kids and a real job, and the idea of sitting down with a game that's going to be 4 hours and not have to like go, okay, you can take all the turn. That doesn't just happen very often. So I don't know exactly what necessarily is missing. What I think it needs is just more and more people to keep taking up the challenge of trying to make games so they can find out. So things that jump to mind, like, if I wanted to port Call of Duty to the Bevy engine, where would I get stuck? Probably lots of places. And maybe you'd have to write unsafe a lot. But maybe it wouldn't. Maybe it wouldn't be as bad as all that. But I don't think we know until we try. We don't see a lot of things like first person shooters. I think I've seen it. There is a game development in Rust meetup that's every month. I wish I could remember the exact name of it, but I bet if you do Rust game development meetup and you look it up, you can find it.
I think it's called Rust Game Development or something like that. There's a section on Discord.
Yeah, there's a section on Discord. I try to attend. I usually just lurk because it's on like Saturday mornings at the end of the month. But anyway, and there are people doing like, full-fledged 3D engines, and they're showing what they've rendered and they're showing the things they're doing. So they're making progress. And it's really cool to see because, I don't know, like I said, I did C++ for a long time. And part of it might just be that hopefully I'm a better programmer than I was 17 years ago.
Mm.
But I can write Rust in Emacs with Rust Analyzer hooked up. And if I try to write C++ in Emacs, I just can't do it. I need an IDE. And you need to know so many rules to get stuff right. And I can tell you the code I used to write did not have those rules in it.
Okay, so I mean, it sounds like the pieces are there, but you just need to build it. But what about engines like Bevy and the other ones that are kind of come? And I forgot to say the other name. There's so many of these kind of engines. I understand they're not quality as like the top three, but do you think they're
Right.
like good enough to make most things at least?
Well, if you're a person with if you're a person with a dream, or you're spending your weekends and night times working on it, or if you got a team of 2 or 3, I think you totally can. I think people just got to do more of it. So, like I said, I made using even Godot, right? I made an iPhone app for it. And if, you asked and someone said, can you make an iOS game in, or it was like, you can't make an iOS app in Rust. I'm like, yeah, you can. I did it. I'd write 2 lines of Objective-C to fit one thing into the main of the app, but that was it. I wrote the stinking thing in Rust. It was silly and just for funsies and for me to learn stuff. So, I mean, I think, like, for instance, if you wanted to write, I haven't looked at, like, the performance numbers, right? But if you're like, I'm going to port Doom to Bevy, you could probably get started on that effort now, and you could probably make a lot of progress before you ran into stuff that really was a limitation. And even then, it wouldn't be a limitation of, like, the language. It'd be a limitation of nobody's written something to do this yet. And unfortunately, like, we're programmers. Writing that kind of stuff is what we do.
Yeah, I did see that there's already a port of Doom, but I don't know how done it is. It seems like it's done all the way. Obviously, it's called Rust Doom.
Go figure. I had a feeling when I said that, I was like, I bet someone did it.
So, but this one says it's a little Doom 1 and 2 renderer written in Rust, so I don't know what that exactly means. But it's been updated somewhat recently, back in October of last year, so I think it's pretty recent.
Doom renderer might just mean you can like wander around the scenes and look at the levels from Doom, but it might not have the full-fledged game. It might not have menu systems or enemies or anything to shoot or sound effects.
Mm.
Which doesn't mean it can't do it. That's just whoever's working on it, they stopped needing to progress. That's actually, and it was like one of the reasons it's been good to have the discipline of writing a book is that I start a lot of projects. I'm sure everyone else does this too, right? Like if you go to my GitHub, you'll see like 140 partially started projects. I start a lot of stuff. And if I was going to port Doom in Rust today, or if I was going to do Doom in WebAssembly, like, okay, I'm going to try to write Doom in WebAssembly. I could even use something like macro quad. I can use something small.
Mm-hmm.
I would probably get somewhere along the lines of, well, I can render a level, and I can move around. Bored now. Try new thing. There's sort of, I think it's just like on making any software project. There's a grind to go from the cool prototyping phase to the finish. That middle section, if it was baseball, we'd call it the dog days of summer, right? Like pro basketball right now. I like sports, if you couldn't tell by my username. Where there's that middle chunk, and you just sort of got to put in the work and do the stuff. And it's not fun anymore. Doesn't mean it's impossible. You just don't feel like getting up and necessarily doing it without some motivation behind it. That's why we have jobs, I suppose.
Yeah, definitely requires some motivation. Maybe it's good to kind of start getting towards the book, right? So what's interesting about your book that I've heard is that you actually do build some type of small game engine, right? So is it like you use this game engine throughout the rest of the book?
Yeah, I mean, you do develop it's a game
Maybe we can
engine.
kind of talk about like from the beginning to the end at the high level. Maybe that's easier. It's kind of get an idea what we're in for.
Yeah, so the book is really like, sometimes, I'm not sure how many pages it's going to end up, but sometimes I joke it's my 300-page tutorial. But basically, the book is focused on writing a game because, I mean, one thing that I think tons of developers get in trouble with, right, is they start trying to write an engine, a full-fledged one that's going to have an editor and a scene graph, and it's going to load and save, artifacts that you can put in source control, and you're going to have a prefab system like Unity, and like 2 years have gone by. Do you got a game? No. And I think I even tell the story at one point in the book of like, I did that once in JavaScript. I started getting into JavaScript development more seriously. I think like a lot of web developers did, where it's like, well, I used to just write a little JavaScript here and there to get something done. But, now I'm like really trying to learn and get into the language. And I started to write a 2D game engine in it. And I got so focused on writing the game engine that like I never shipped anything. I think I had a screen, I could move around, and I was constantly iterating on the engine. I got frustrated and realized I should have just done a game. So the way the book works is you do make a game engine in the sense that like you need an engine to play a game. You've got a game loop, you handle input, you play sounds, you render graphics, obviously all in the web browser. But it's all done in the service of making a game. So like the structure of each chapter tends to be somewhere along the lines of, here's, the thing we're going to do. Like, okay, we in chapter 2, don't quote me on what the chapters are, but in chapter 2 we got an image on the screen. In chapter 3 he's going to get animated. Well, that's going to mean refactoring the code to have a proper game loop, which will go every 60 frames a second with a tick and keep track of stuff. So you spend a bit of time in game engine land, and then near the end of the chapter it's like, hey, remember what we did set out to do this for? Now we're going to actually implement that. And when I get it right, which I can tell from my tech reviewers, the last part of that is the easy part. You put all the chunks together, there's a lot of time spent in things like, I do a lot in state machines. And I say we, like I'm the sole author, but I've started to develop like this, like there's the audience that's reading along with me, because it really is written in just sort of like as if you were in the basement with me. I'd have to make more room. My office isn't all that big and I don't have a separate office chair. And we go through and we build a game. So at the end, you've got an endless runner where different obstacles come at your running guy and you have to jump over them. And you've even got a little menu for new game and stuff. From there, like, I think it'll work as a really good starting point for someone who would like, if you wanted to compete in game jams for fun on the weekends, if you wanted to build something bigger, you've got something going and you can actually do it. So that's sort of how the book works. Yeah, I don't know if I have a better way to answer to that.
Yeah, how come you decided to look at WebAssembly versus other platforms like your native platform?
Because you can get deployed right away. So, like, one of the nice things of this is that without the hardest, in some ways, part to any of these kinds of things is writing chapter 1, because you want to make sure you can explain to people how to set up their system. And if you're building native stuff, okay, I don't even have a Windows machine right now. Like, I don't know if your stuff will work on that. And you can get it deployed. You don't have to worry about how are you going to distribute it. In the second to last chapter, I take you through how to check into GitHub, use a GitHub action to deploy to Netlify. So you're going to have it up and running. That was one of the reasons. The other is like, it's just giving you the browser. So the game doesn't use WebGL, or I can never remember the name of the Rust library. It doesn't use like the Rust library for, well, interacting with WebGL. It just uses the canvas to render items on screen. It's a small game, so that works. But by doing that, like, that saves you a bunch of time where we're not also writing a renderer. I didn't want this to turn into Vulkan or WebGL, and we have, pages and pages of things that are in shader language, all so you can write a 2D pixel. That was actually part of the reason I didn't end up using one of the engines that's out there for the book either. It was like, you know what? I want to know, like, I want to make sure we're staying in Rust as much as possible and know the stuff that's in there is gonna still work in a couple years for the most part. To use Bevy as an example, it's, they tell you up front, this isn't a criticism, on the web page, right? Like, is unstable, we will have breaking changes. And I'm glad they do that because, I mean, without getting into it too much, there's plenty of, libraries and engines and even programming languages that'll say, oh no, we're ready for use in production, and then break everything 2 weeks later, and you're like sitting in a lurch. But because they do that, I didn't want to put that in a book, and I didn't want to necessarily teach Bevy anyway. It's not my project. But by making it just like we're rendering to the canvas, and I've joked with one of my coworkers, this is really his fault, in that I've had this old HTML5 canvas book for forever, which I didn't end up using, but I used to joke that I was just going to port the whole thing to Rust. And when iterating on the ideas for the book, that sort of came up. It's like, well, obviously I'm not really going to port this 9-10-year-old book, but what if we did it in HTML5? We do the canvas, so you got interactive stuff going on screen right out of the gate. I think that gives you an idea too of sort of where it's aimed at, right? Like, I'm not expecting readers to be experts in 3D math.
Yeah, that's something I think I need to go back to. I know I'm another podcast. I talked to a guest who did some, I don't think it was 3D stuff necessarily, but it was something that he did need some math for. And he said I highly recommend Khan Academy. So if you want to learn like how to draw all these different shapes, check out Khan Academy. That's where I picked up the stuff. So I think if I do get into something like that, yeah, that's probably where I'd have to go. I know like I'm pretty decent with math, but when it comes to like 3D things, my mind just goes blank. It's just outside of my realm for the time being.
Well, and it just wasn't necessarily like, the book is already longer than I anticipated it to be. It's going to be over 300 pages. I know that much. And if you had asked me when I started this thing, can you write a 300-page book? I would have said, no, absolutely not. I'll top out at 150. So, you did something even more complicated. Now you're at 600. But I really wanted to do it from scratch to minimize all the dependencies and such. And I'm pretty happy with like how most of it turned out, in that I have other ideas for, games I want to fiddle with. Like, this all sort of started where I started a Twitch stream when COVID started, because that was kind of the law at the time. If you were a developer and when COVID started, you had to start streaming on Twitch, with more of my like just Rust learnings. And then I was doing some game dev in Rust. And that's kind of been on hold while I try to finish the book. But anyway, the whole thing was, at that point I was learning and such, and I didn't want to get tied up in the book with like weird details that may or may not work in 9 months, a year from now. So I felt like, the browser is there, and the web is a great place to deploy stuff. I mean, it really is, right? Like, you can do almost anything. You probably can't do the latest and greatest AAA game on the web. But I really didn't want to leave people hanging with, oh, you've built a game. Now I hope you can get through the Steam process greenlight or something. And I don't know. I also think that's kind of the sweet spot for where WebAssembly is. I think I'm in the minority in this one, though.
Yeah, I'm not too sure what to say about WebAssembly, especially because it's still relatively new. And you can also run it directly on hardware too, or something like that, or on OSs or something. So that gets things really confusing for me.
I see a lot of people get really excited about it. I admit I don't really get it. Like, the part where you can have, I think it's WASI, and you talk to the hardware, and then you could run Rust on the hardware. And I was like, but I can already run Rust on the hardware. I just build an executable. And I guess, yeah, okay, but you only have to build one. And as long as WebAssembly is there, I can deploy it everywhere. That's the dream. But I don't know. To me, like, the WebAssembly, the part that's great about WebAssembly is the idea of saying, okay, I can write this theoretically whatever language I like, compile it to WebAssembly, and deploy on the web. That's really cool. And, in the book, we use the WASM BindGen tools to There's like one index.html file and maybe one line of JavaScript I make you type, but everything is in Rust. Part of what I like about WebAssembly and Rust is like you wouldn't have to do it that way. And it might not even be the most practical way. I just thought it was the most fun way because you could write everything in Rust. But you could also do things like, okay, I'm going to. This is actually the game of life example that's on the Rust WebAssembly website, right? You start with JavaScript and you call into Rust, which is also like a great approach. If you want to do something with like 3.js and JavaScript, you have a few options. You could do Rust and you could bind to any of the functions you want to call in 3.js. Actually, the book does a little of that. I use pixie.js because the book is focused on 2D stuff, but you could do that. Or you could write JavaScript enough 3.js to then call into Rust and have Rust do some of the stuff it's really good at. I mean, I used to leave a browser tab open all day with the game going until I got sound working, and then I couldn't take listening to the sound, the background music all day long. But one day, I don't remember when, but like I turned on the task manager and just went and looked at memory consumption because I went, God forbid I screwed something up. You know, the game's been running all day. How's it doing? Well, the memory consumption on the game was, of all the tasks running in my browser, was like near the bottom, maybe towards the middle. Number one was Jira. It was taking over all of the memory on my browser. It's impressive when you think about it. It's not like Jira's taking over movies or something.
Yeah, I think I heard some feedback saying that actually JavaScript is still better than WebAssembly for a lot of things, but I'm not too sure how true that statement is.
It depends, right? Like it's like everything.
I mean, like in
The
terms of
answer is it
performance
depends.
and something like that. Like I think when we had the U guy on here, he was saying that hey, there's like you specifically says, oh, JavaScript is going to be faster for some reason.
Yeah, and I think that's generally true. And there's a few spots like the book where it doesn't really come up as an issue, but I feel like there are some little areas where Rust, because this isn't what it does, isn't as well suited. So for some things like loading an image and making sure it got loaded before you try to draw it, you're doing JavaScript game development, you got to do that. You can use the onload event handler in JavaScript, which you can use in Rust too, but you end up having to put in a channel and listen for the channel on the other end. And there's a little bit of extra work. So I think if you wanted to do a hybrid approach of doing like JavaScript that called into Rust, is you could break up your architecture a little bit so that JavaScript, especially the really, really browsery stuff, stayed in the browser and Rust did like all the calculation stuff that it's good at. But I didn't do it that way because I thought it'd be more fun to write the whole thing in Rust. And I like structuring Rust code better than I like structuring JavaScript code.
Yeah, I was just trying to take a look at some stuff. Maybe it's just about rendering the UI. It's maybe slightly faster. So I was just taking a look at.
I could see that. I can't say I've done the benchmarking.
It seems like it's always faster for some reason. I think it's maybe talking about because yeah, I remember Ute specifically talks about it. They say it's faster, but maybe it's not when it comes to writing to the DOM or something.
There are definitely issues when talking back and forth to the DOM from WebAssembly because you have to basically turn everything into. This is one of those things I shouldn't say off the top of my head because I won't get my facts quite right. But essentially, you have to turn everything into a big old buffer of memory, pass it over, and then the JavaScript has to put it back together again and then pass it back. I expected that to bite me in the butt at some point. It hasn't really. I am so far pleasantly surprised. I mean, I planned ahead, or it's like, well, chapter 10 is going to be where we figure out the performance issues. And then there weren't any performance issues. It was kind of a happy accident. I was like, well, but I can tell them how to benchmark their code. So we've got some benchmarking going on of like how fast things go. Now, if I put 10,000 pixels on the or images on the screen, if we had a flock of birds, there might be issues.
Yeah, I mean, benchmarking is huge when you're making video games. I heard from my manager in the bank when he was talking about game developers, like he had some conversations with them, and like if they're going to focus on making stuff as fast as possible, like they'll go back when they go to port a game, they'll just go back and like rewrite the engine from scratch if that's what it takes, right? Because every single system out there, it's got different architectures. So you got to optimize in different ways.
Yeah. I mean, and 60 frames a second, right? So you've got 0.016666 seconds to do everything. There's no in your frame, make a web request.
Why is 60 frames like the magic number? Like I thought like your TV is like 20 something or something like that, right?
So film is 24 frames a second. Computer monitors used to be 60 frames a second. Now they go even higher. So I think that's where the 60 came from. Anyway, so it had to do with the refresh rate of the computer screen. So film's 24 frames a second, but the computer refresh rate was 30 frames a second.
So when you see the hertz, right, that's what that usually means, right? 60 hertz. But now I think 120 hertz seems to be the new one.
Yeah.
A lot of people are looking at.
Yeah, I mean, My TV upstairs might even go faster than that. But in the browser, if you use request animation frame, it's generally hitting. That's what we found too, benchmarking the little walk the dog game with Red Hat Boy. That's the little game you end up making is little, and this is all like I was able to get from open source places on the web, which is great nowadays. Like if you're doing indie game development, I feel like it's the perfect time for game dev as a hobby or a like slight commercial business because there's so much available to you and it's so much easier to deploy. So we're doing is like a little. You can almost, if you know, you run the Chrome web browser when it can't get to the internet, you get the little dinosaur that's jumping rocks as he runs across. You get a little boy who's lost his dog off a leash. I must have been looking at the howler monkey you just heard at the time, but you jump over rocks and on platforms to catch him. And so we do some stuff with collision detection. You know, you got to get your keyboard input. The collision detection chapter ended up being fun for me to write. Probably not as much fun for my editors because it's just simple box to box collision detection. But I had written the chapter with this sort of note that went, you know, your boxes are too big. Go back and take another look at this. And so when I'm rewriting the chapter on collision detection, I sent it back to him. Editor's like, you changed a lot because we end up with a slightly more advanced one the second time through with it's just subdivided boxes, but you explained everything and suddenly you've given the chapter another 10 plus pages. And your editor's like, I thought you were done.
Yeah, so how has the process been then? I mean, are you having any kind of days where you just cannot write, or how's your writing process?
So for me, the process is usually basically get the kids to school on the bus in the morning and then write until my normal day starts for work. And then after the work day's over, write some more. Now it's very much editing, right? Like I'm not writing that much anymore. This last chapter might have some more writing-y stuff in it because I'm kind of on the last chapter that's long and hard for editing, right? Which is put the front end of the UI in there. It's just a matter of having a new game button in there, but to fit it all in, and this isn't a unique challenge to my game or the game making the book, right? It's just a challenge for video games in general is, you know, the web browser is built for like, put a few buttons on the screen and click them, and then events will happen, and then the screen will change. But like a game is, you know, spinning there every 60 seconds going. Or not every 60 seconds, but 60 times a second going, hey, give me something to do. And it just changes the way stuff works. I mean, if you want to go way into the Wayback Machine, it reminds me of Win32 programming, where in C you had, or Windows in C, you would have this thing where it would peek to see if there was a message. If there was one, it would get it. And then you would react to the message. You know, it's not the way we normally do stuff in kind of traditional web development. So, I mean, it's a challenge to then fit clicking things on the screen into that paradigm. I think it comes out pretty well, but it's a surprising, that particular section, you write a surprising amount of code to go, okay, click new game. Yay, new game button works.
I think you brought up a pretty good point. So looking over the notes, you kind of sparked another kind of topic in my head. Is like, I think you're one of the few people who I've talked to who said that Rust is just not ready for web, which is interesting, right?
I don't know that it's not ready for web. I just don't know why I would necessarily choose it. You know, ask me again. Like, okay, I can give you the reason I might choose web for my blog, right? Like most people, my blog is now a dust bowl. That's partly Packet's fault. They found one of my blogs. They said it was really good. They said, do you want to write a book? And now I don't write for my blog anymore because there's no more time. So, which means at some point this year, I may redeploy, because my blog currently uses Hugo for static page generation. I may redeploy mine in a Rust-based one because it just doesn't feel right to use a Go-based tool if, you know, I'm trying to get myself even more involved in the Rust community. And I'm sure it'll be great if I write a Rust site. Most of the stuff is there. What I'm wondering, though, is if somebody is saying, hey, do our web application, and they're going to pay me money. Aside from I like Rust and want to do it, I don't know what my argument for Rust is when there's so many other good tools for that problem out there. So it's like, it's not so much a criticism of Rust. It's like, well, if they say use, I don't know, Blazor or ASP, or if they say use Ruby on Rails or Django, or pick your web framework, they're all mostly pretty good. Should I really be like, nah, I want to use Rust? Like, I don't know what the differentiator there is. Like, I feel like of the languages that compile to WebAssembly, I understand why I would prefer Rust over the others. And if I was writing, say, some back-end serverless stuff, I could see why I would want to write Rust. You know, doing like request just process a thing. Like I think it was Dropbox that famously sort of, hey, we put Rust in production, optimize this one chunk. And I think GitHub had it. There's some other places with it too. But if I just wanted like monolithic web app, honestly, I'd probably end up just saying like, okay, Rails generate, go grab a PDF to refresh my memory on Rails because it's been a little while kind of thing.
Well, I mean, if you're going for performance, though, like really high performance, then I think that's something to consider then,
Yeah,
right?
I think if you were going really high performance, then it is. For sure it is actually. But when you ask about like just traditional sort of web applications, that's what came to mind to me was like so and so wants a shopping cart, like performance isn't usually the defining factor of those kind of projects.
Yeah, I guess I'm in the same boat too. Like, obviously, I'm a big fan of Elixir, right? The Phoenix framework itself is so good at web. It's not going to be as performant as you can with Rust, but it is still pretty damn good. And there is a JIT that happened recently. So, and I haven't found like, people are just scaling like crazy, like Discord and stuff. They're using Elixir, they're using Rust. And I think those two together are a fantastic pair for the high concurrency and greatness of the Beam from Elixir. And then also like the super high performance of code from Rust. I think it's hard to beat this pair. I think you can go
It
very
seems like
far.
it can be a pretty cool combination.
But like going straight Rust, I mean, you should be able to build something that's pretty decent. But the problem is, like you said, I think it's kind of like I think the situation of web for Rust is similar thing. It's like there's no de facto framework, there's no de facto Rust game engine that everybody uses, and it's up to the quality of competing high engine, right? So it's the same thing with web. Like there was Rocket come along that was kind of like a Rails version, kind of like everything baked in, right? And then there's Actix Web, which is probably the best candidate, I think, just in terms of time and use and amount of popularity. And then of course there's like Warp, and then there's another one, Axum.
Yeah, there's plenty of them. And they all have great, like, a lot of them have really great features. I've used Rocket before. I probably will use Actix Web soon. Like I said, I do want to redo, my website and actually get it in Rust. Probably not until April, though. And there's nothing wrong with any of them. It's just, I think it's like with some of the other languages, like, I don't particularly enjoy writing traditional Java code, right? But if I need to write a lot of the kinds of sort of client work I get, and it's like we want a website, like, well, we know how to do all the stuff in Java. Oh, you want payment processing, authentication, you need to talk to a database, which I know Rust can do almost all those things. Like you said, right? Like it is very similar to like the game situations. Like, and that's sort of where with games, I do feel like it's a little bit different in that, not always, right? Like, but the kinds of web development I imagine are not things I would necessarily do for myself because that changes sort of the calculus a lot. Like I said, like I have like 5 different ports of Space Invaders. I don't do those because anybody gave me money for them. I do them because I liked Space Invaders when I was 5 years old, and I think it'd be cool to have my own port of Space Invaders. And I probably will do one in Rust at some point. I just haven't done that one. And for that, like, sure, do Rust as a website. But I do feel like if someone's coming to me wanting a web app for their place, right? Whatever it is, be they small or big client, I need them to give me some reason where I go, okay, for that, I do need to use Rust. If the performance equation comes out, it's like, okay, then now let's talk about maybe doing this thing in Rust versus doing it in one of the traditional ones.
Yeah, I think that's valid. So, okay, I don't think I have anything else to ask you. We've already spent quite a bit of time together. In fact, we're like a half hour over time. Your book sounds super interesting, right? I've already got a couple of books. We were talking before the podcast, even way before, right, on Discord about like current books in Rust and then like and also in game development, right? So I think your book is definitely a book that's like an auxiliary book. Like I think they're all auxiliary. They kind of play off each other. They're going to be lots of overlapping, but I like that you're focusing on WebAssembly, and I like that you're actually going to be building an engine. I'm not sure of too many others that are kind of building an engine in terms of books out there that I can think of, but in West at least.
Yeah, I can't think of anything. I probably would have found it by now.
Yeah, so I think it's great that you're covering a different style, right? Same topic as some others, but different perspective, which I think is what we need. We need more perspectives, then you can have a much more well-rounded understanding.
Yeah, I mean, it looks like it's a good year or two for Rust books, and I think you're right. I think that's super needed. Yeah, it seems like for a long stretch, like you had the Rust book on online, and then the Rustanomicon. I'm not sure I've ever said that out loud. I hope I pronounced it right. Presumably, it's like Necronomicon, but that was sort of it. I know. I mean, like Rust in Action came out last year, which is great, and now we're getting like a lot more Rust books coming in. I can't remember if you had it or as a guest. There's one that I'm interested in that I haven't gotten a chance to read yet, but refactoring to Rust. I know I'm looking forward to. I think it may not be as pointed at my hobby horse of game development, but it definitely tickles my like inner liking to put things together that don't necessarily fit on the first try.
Yeah. I mean, I appreciate it. And I'm looking forward to this book actually coming out pretty soon. So if you're interested in game development and, possibly looking into how game engines are built and also WebAssembly, and of course, if you love Rust, I think this could be an awesome book for you. So definitely check it out. It's from Pact. The name of the book is called Game Development with Rust and WebAssembly. You can buy it directly, but I think Pact is one of the places that they also kind of want to push you towards getting a subscription every month. The same with O'Reilly is a big one for that.
But the packet has their subscription service, yeah, so that you can like get a bunch of their stuff too. But also, yeah, you can buy it directly, and it's on Amazon.
Yeah, you can get on
That was
Amazon.
the one I sent to my parents. Send the Amazon link to my parents so they know it's real.
Yeah, so you can go ahead and check out the book. I think, if you're interested in the book, go ahead and check it out. Yeah, just give it a try. Again, I highly recommend you buy it straight from the publisher because then I think more of a cut will go to you. That's the way Manning at least goes. I'm not too
That's
sure about.
usually how it goes.
I think for everybody, it's like that. Amazon's got to take their cut, just like any other big
Right.
corporation. So if you're interested, you want to support the author, buy it directly from Pact if you can. That's just my recommendation. And I think Eric is also very easy to go out and reach out to if you're interested. He can probably also let you know what's going on with the book if in case you have some concerns or some interest in it. And yeah, check it out. Mhm.
Yeah, say it's if you wanted to find me online, it's pretty much anywhere you find Payton Rules, which is Payton rules. It's Pay because people will get confused and think it's Pey and then think I'm a Peyton Manning fan. It's like no, Walter Payton,
Walter
Chicago,
Payton.
not Indianapolis.
Sweetness.
Yeah,
Yeah. Even the website's paytonrules.com. So,
yeah. Twitch stream whenever it comes back, which will be soon.
okay.
Looking forward. I'm actually looking forward to bringing it back because I want to take the stuff we did for the book and put some like more on top of it. I think that'll be a lot of fun.
All right. Thank you for the time. I really appreciate it. And maybe you'll come back again with maybe talk more about your Twitch streams and what you're up to on there.
Oh, that'd be great. Yeah. Well, thank you for having me.
Thanks.